And I'm just going to stay on here because we're straight into the next session, which will be very, very exciting. We're moving through the ecosystems at quite a rapid pace during these 2 days. And the next one is a talk about that. This session will be super interesting because we have some amazing discussion partners with us. There are experts on both the Asian and European ecosystems. So let me welcome my old colleague and the brilliant futurist Chris Crespo.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you everyone for joining. So I just want to check, do we have both Tonis and Vital on the call? Yes? Great. Great to see you again. Thank you for joining us. So why don't we just take one very quick minute to introduce ourselves. So Varun, please go ahead and just give us a quick intro of who you are.
Hi, this is Varun. I am based in Singapore. I run EY's fintech business practice for emerging markets globally. Used to run a startup which we sold to Ant Financial, and currently working on a couple of digital banks and digital ecosystem platforms in Southeast Asia.
Wonderful. Thank you, Varun. And Tonis, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I am ING's economist for digital finance and regulation, which basically means I'm an economist with affinity for IT and digital topics. So I research these kind of topics ranging from data portability, data sharing, to digital currencies, from crypto to central bank digital currencies. And of course, the intensifying competition between banks and platforms, big techs in particular. And I try to tell ING's clients smart things about these, but I also am in a regular conversation with policymakers and other stakeholders for ING to discuss our views on that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tonis. So we are talking today about the distinct differences that exist between the financial services ecosystem in Europe versus the financial services ecosystem in Asia. So why don't we just start discussing a little bit what's the regional context in these societies? Because we understand that the ecosystems have evolved to meet societal needs. So let's talk a little bit about the societal context both in Asia and in Europe. Let's start with Asia.
In Asia, what has happened in last 60, 70 years, most of these countries became independent from the respective colonial rules. So there was a mad development rush. A lot of infrastructure needed to be developed. There was no post-war resurrection or post-war development, and everything was focused on building domestic industries, which couldn't be built before 1950 in any of these countries. So that rapid pace of development, where financial inclusion was a problem, the institutions were not that mature, the governments and governance was not mature. So the focus went on, let's solve these problems. And the common fact was, less governance is better. The less government interferes, the better the private enterprise can solve the problems. And that was something which created the massive amount of innovation. And because there was not much legacy of the legal system, the industry was always ahead of creating solutions, and then the regulations came behind it. So we usually say this in East that make love, not war. And that's why we do not have a fraction of the regulations around different stuff. And that community-driven, market-driven context is what drives Asian innovation.
Great, and the same question to you, Tonis. What are the societal needs in Europe that have driven to the development of the ecosystem in Europe?
Yeah, I think obviously Europe is a lot different in this respect. It's often said that the current drive by, for example, the European Commission is that Europe wants to be the referee of the digital world, and then it's also immediately said, well, but referees never win a game, which is true. But I think it's good indeed to indeed look behind this drive to be the referee, and indeed the fact that Europe is in economic aspects, but also in other aspects, is a mature society. It's also an aging society. If you look at demographics, then Japan is ahead. And basically Europe is trailing some 15 years behind Japan in demographic terms. Mm-hmm. China is then 15 years behind Europe. And well, other Asian countries have their own demographics, but they are still decades away from the aging problem, at least development, should I say, that we see in Europe. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the influence that such an aging development and being a mature society has, because an older society tends to be a richer society, and people tend to be protective of what they have. And this is something that you see in a cultural context, but you definitely also see it in a financial context. And this is, of course, this translates in politics, in political priorities, and this again translates in how regulation and supervision are formed. So Europe wants to regulate, European supervisors want to regulate, want to supervise, want to get the rules first and then see whether everything is compliant, want to manage risks. And sometimes, and I'm also talking about myself here, of course, we tend to get frustrated maybe about this risk-based approach in Europe. But I think it's important to keep in mind where it's coming from and to understand that, well, this is what an aging and mature society tends to do.
Right, and Tonis, I want to stay with you then, because perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about the nuances of the ecosystem in Europe that are the result of this social context that you've just described.
Well, what you see indeed is that, we have to admit from Europe that we've fallen behind in digital terms, right? It's the US big techs and the Chinese big techs that are calling the shots, or that are making the show worldwide. And if you look at the fintech universe, then although, of course, we have this great fintech week in Copenhagen, and there are fintech hubs throughout Europe, there are other parts in the world, including Asia, where there is more dynamism. And this definitely has to do with the fact, indeed, that the institutional approach, the regulatory approach is more restrictive, which has to do with the factors I mentioned. And I think it's really illustrative to just simply look at the mandates that financial supervisors have. Just reading to you, it's just a few sentences, don't worry, that the Monetary Authority in Singapore has in its mandate, the MAS aims to make Singapore the leading global financial center in Asia. If you contrast that to any mandate by any central bank or financial supervisor in Europe, then you encounter words like safety of the system, stability, soundness, avoiding risks, minimizing, well, blah, 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 which is a completely different mindset. And this explains how supervisors run their sandboxes. We will get maybe to that later. So the entire mindset in Europe is really different. And this has an important influence on the climate, the innovation climate in Europe.
So it sounds from what you're saying that you see the Asian ecosystem as a more proactive ecosystem that is really trying to push things forward, while the European one seems to be more concerned with ensuring the protectionism of the entire ecosystem and other players in it.
Yeah.
Varun, would you agree with that characterization of the Asian ecosystem, and what other nuances do you see in the ecosystem in Singapore and beyond?
See, Singapore, and I'm the one who will be launching a book called Singapore, the FinTech Nation, later this year on that topic itself. And the DNA is very different. Singapore has only one regulator for all asset classes. Banking, insurance, securities is all under one window. So the outlook of the government itself is we need to make the system work, and the financial regulator's job is to keep the consumer safe and then scale the nation. Because as a small country with no historical resources, it was a small port city. Services is what important for us. We have to be a just environment which is politically neutral and independent, and which is fair for every country to come collaborate and do business with. And that's the objective. You see, Southeast Asia has 550 million population, of which 200 million don't even have access to basic financial services. And Tunis guys launched a digital bank in Philippines. There are 50 million people without a bank account in Philippines today. The stability, safety, security, those words are not the first three words. For a regulator who has half of his country without having access to basic financial services, basic protection, people have to store money below the pillow in their house. The word safety means very different for that person versus in Europe, where everybody has multiple bank accounts. If they want to, you are overbanked. You have too many banks who are not even able to use their capital fully. So the context, the needs are very different. We are looking at a population where more than 50% people are below 35. They want jobs, they want education, they want access. They are at the prime of their health, and the needs of like the Europe in terms of aging and everything was 20, 30, 40 years out. So this is the Asian generation to build. This is the Asian Industrial Revolution plus, which is digital. This is the digital industrial revolution for Asia. So the priorities and aspirations couldn't be different from other markets like Europe.
That's really fascinating. And let's stay with you, Varun. Could you describe for us what is the relationships that exist between various players in the ecosystem? I'm talking about banks, fintechs, regulators, etc. How do they relate to each other in the Asian ecosystem?
See, in Asian ecosystem is very different. So Singapore, an example, we have a WhatsApp group where it's an offline non-government WhatsApp group where 6 people from regulator are there. Startups can ask their question, give their feedback. So top bankers are there, top regulators are there, and everybody can talk. And that's the safe zone. And I built that 5-6 years ago. And that was simple because we didn't have a platform where regulators also want to talk, because they said we don't hear. We hear stuff from media, which is not the fair interpretation. Why don't you guys talk to us? And everybody was like, we're scared to talk to you. So they're like, okay, so what do we do? I said, I run this community in WhatsApp, come and talk here. And you have to tell people that they need to be stop of being afraid of you. They're like, okay, we'll try. They tried and they saw such awesome reaction. Now, Monetary Authority of Singapore has permanent 6 to 8 people always there in the group. They take questions, give feedback. And of course, you still have to get the formal feedback through the email and everything. But having that level of personal touch, imagine, and do you expect like central bankers from any European markets having WhatsApp private groups in any market? And Singapore is not the only one. Southeast Asia, across wide, the regulators have people in their division who are the industry face. So the industry development and the regulatory side work hand in hand. So the regulatory side doesn't say, I hate these trade promotion guys. They say, if we don't help our people, then nobody else will. We got to help our young companies. We got to help them solve our national problems, our society problems. Otherwise, these young companies will not survive. So that level of ownership, the communal ownership, is something which is a very Asian spirit.
That's really interesting. And Jonas, I'd like to turn to you now. Would you say that a similar approach could work in the ecosystem in Europe, or what are the differences in the way in which ecosystem players relate to each other in Europe?
Yeah, I think indeed having a WhatsApp group would be a great addition for Europe. However, I think it's safe to say that they are not there currently. WhatsApp groups which combine financial supervisors with existing institutions and fintech startups. When you want to approach a supervisor here in Europe, either as a fintech or as an established bank, for example, which wants to run a innovation project by a supervisor, then, well, many supervisors also in Europe now have sandbox environments, which is great, which is a great step forward. But still, you don't get there by WhatsApp. You get there by making an appointment, and probably you have to wait a few weeks. And I think the approach is very different where, for example, in Singapore, there are even possibilities to get a subsidy. And when you approach a sandbox, and you are basically helped in the trajectory passing through the sandbox. While in Europe, what the sandbox means is that as a fintech or an established institution, you get to talk to the central bankers, which is great. And indeed, they are constructive, but their view remains, the central bank view in Europe and the supervisor's view, their view remains, we are here to minimize risk for society. I mean, the view just espoused by Varun of we are here to help nurture our small companies. it's much lower on the priority list. And I think there are a few exceptions. Switzerland, for example, the Bank of England to a certain extent, and perhaps unsurprisingly, these are also institutions which in their mandate, aside from financial stability, also have things like promoting the competitiveness of the domestic economy,
Right.
or in the case of the Bank of England, promoting the diversity of the financial system. And it's that part of the mandate which helps them to also be more welcoming to startups and innovation.
Right. Okay. So, based on what I'm hearing, I'd like to try to be a little bit more provocative with the following question. So, it sounds like what we're saying is that the needs of society are very different in both regions of the world. Perhaps, if I can sum it up, we can say that Europe and the West is overbanked, while there's still a number of underbanked people in Asia, and therefore the development of those ecosystems has catered to address those specific needs from society. Would it be fair for us to say that perhaps then the type of innovation that we're seeing stemming up from Asia, where we see digital services, where we see services engulfed into super apps, is that a model that could eventually lead to innovation in the Western world? Or is the innovation that we require in the Western world so different from Asia that it will have to evolve in its own way?
You're asking me?
Both of you.
Well, I think, then let me answer, let me go first. What we currently see is basically that, at least looking at Europe, that the main platforms are now not European. They are US based, and we have Chinese platforms that are not yet active in Europe, but maybe they will be in the future. So those platforms did not come from Europe, which is a sign. Luckily, European policymakers have woken up to this fact, and are now trying to promote domestic innovation in Europe. Well, mostly they try to promote this by adapting regulation. So there we are again, regulation. But at least we are making progress there. I think we also have to keep in mind that so there is this institutional aspect, but an older, aging society is probably also slower to adapt to innovation. Because older people, they tend to think that they have less need for all kinds of new fancy stuff. I think in the end, also older people have adopted to the big tech platforms. And so in the end, the innovation will be adopted. It just will be a slower process. There might be a need for innovative startups, for example, to team up earlier in the process with established names, because that's the way to gain access to those more conservative clients. And I'm not here to insult anyone. I'm sure there are some 75-year-old digital hipsters in the audience, so I'm generalizing a lot here.
Yeah.
But I think, it requires a different approach to innovation.
Great. And Varun, just very quickly, your take on the same question.
See, I believe that there will be a bit of challenge for super apps to form in Europe, because the costs imposed by the regulations are, in a lot of scenarios, quite prohibitive for a small company to go with. So for a large company, it's okay. But for a small company, by the time you survive all these regulations, it's already a tough shot.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of other markets where they can scale up much rapidly. And the definition of privacy, the definition of data, safety, security are very different and very culture sensitive.
Right.
In Asia, for example, if you are not communicating with the person on WhatsApp or WeChat, that means you're not even close to that person.
You're out. Yeah.
You're out. Email is too official.
Right.
You don't have a personal touch in it.
Yeah.
In Europe, if you start to WhatsApp the person right after you meet the first time, that's probably offensive. In Asia, that's very normal. It's nobody cares. Or you go in China, doing that on WeChat after the first meeting, or even before the first meeting, is very normal. So
Right.
the cultural context plus the weight of regulation will make it tough for the super apps to thrive in Europe.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Varun. I'm going to cut you there. I think we have a question here. So I'll hand over to Sarah. We'll pose a question to both of you.
Thank you. It's been super interesting to listen to all of you. I was thinking in terms of questions, what can the European tech ecosystem learn from the Asian and vice versa? I don't know who
from the Asian side, I can say is ensure that there are enough industry people who are serving in the government and policy making to ensure that bureaucrats don't make laws which are not practical for real world. So which is why Gojek, which is the largest company, largest tech company in Indonesia, the founder of that is now the education and technology minister in Indonesia. So learning how to ensure that the bureaucracy is up to the game and prepared for the next generation. If your bureaucrats don't know how programming is, they can't make laws for the tech generation. So ensuring your bureaucracy is ready and bureaucracy is not left behind, because then they will drag everybody else behind with them. So that's something which is a lesson for Asia.
And from the European perspective?
Well, I think in the end, I mean, regulation is not all bad. I mean, there is good reason to have certain protections, like data protections. And I think also in Asia, as societies will progress also in their desires and their needs, maybe in the future desires will evolve somewhat in the European direction, and it's good to be ready for that.
Perfect.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for joining us and for giving us plenty of food for thought. It's been a pleasure having you here. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
All right. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Chris.